In the vibrant heart of Brooklyn, New York, where the city's rhythm dictated the lives of millions, lived Ethan Miller. At 30 years old, Ethan was a digital artist and freelance graphic designer with undeniable talent. Of innovative ideas, vibrant colors, and visual concepts that could easily adorn major advertising campaigns or impact the art world. His Brooklyn apartment reflected this creativity, walls lined with conceptual sketches, state-of-the-art graphic, tablets, and piles of art and design books he swore he'd read as soon as I finished this project. Yet, between this potential and its manifestation, there was an invisible but insurmountable barrier: chronic procrastination. Ethan wasn't lazy, quite the opposite. He spent hours in front of his screen, obsessively researching, planning, and reorganizing files, but rarely executing. Every new project, every client email, every portfolio opportunity was met with initial excitement that quickly transformed into paralyzing anxiety. The root of this inertia wasn't a lack of desire, but an overwhelming fear of not being good enough, of not being able to meet his own high expectations or those of others. Perfection was his standard, and anything less was to him an absolute failure. His perfectionism led him to delay starting, seeking the right moment or the perfect idea, which never arrived. Deadlines were stretched, client follow-up emails went unanswered, and ambitious projects like the long-dreamed launch of his online portfolio with his most conceptual artworks remained incomplete in drafts folders. He lived in a vicious cycle of enthusiasm, procrastination, guilt, and finally, self-sabotage. Ethan's life was a dichotomy. On the surface, he maintained the facade of a busy, talented freelancer. In the few social interactions he allowed himself, he spoke passionately about his future ideas, about the art he wanted to create. Inside, however, he was haunted by anxiety. His nights were filled with unfinished to-do lists. The digital clock by his bed seemed like a silent executioner, marking the passage of time and lost opportunities. His days were filled with distraction. Rituals, endless hours on social media, binge-watching series, exhaustive research for a project that never left the drawing board. These activities offered momentary relief from the pressure, but only deepened the guilt and the feeling of drifting aimlessly. Ethan knew he was wasting his potential, but felt powerless to break the cycle. The creativity that should have been his greatest strength had become the source of his greatest pain, trapped by the tyranny of what if it's not perfect. The comfortable fog of Ethan's procrastination began to dissipate, revealing the cracks forming in his professional and personal life. The catalyst was a particularly important project, a series of digital illustrations for the launch campaign of a new meditation app. The client, ZenFlow, was a promising startup, and this project was a golden opportunity for Ethan to finally showcase his potential and secure a long-term contract. Ethan plunged into the project with his usual initial enthusiasm. Hours of research, the creation of impeccable mood boards, and the development of stunning visual concepts. He felt the creative flame, but, as always, the fear of failure and the pursuit of perfection intervened. It's not good enough. It needs one more touch. I'll wait for the perfect inspiration. Days turned into weeks. Emails from ZenFlow's project manager, Sarah Chen, began to become more frequent, then more urgent. The first major crack came with the loss of the ZenFlow contract. One morning, an email with the subject ZenFlow project update arrived. It wasn't a demand, but a cold notification. Due to uncommunicated delays, we were forced to proceed with another vendor to ensure a timely launch. We wish you the best. In your future endeavors. Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. It wasn't just the loss of money, it was the loss of an opportunity he knew he could have pulled off. Guilt hit him hard, and the silent click of the email sounded like a door closing in his face. The second crack was the reaction of his friend and mentor, Marcus. Marcus was a renowned digital artist who had taken Ethan under his wing years ago, always believing in his raw talent. He was the one who had recommended Ethan for the ZenFlow project. Marcus called Ethan after learning about the lost contract. His voice held no anger but deep disappointment. "Ethan, I put my name on the line for you. I know how good you are. But your work doesn't matter if it never sees the light of day. How many more opportunities are you going to let slip through your fingers? I can't keep watching you self-sabotage like this anymore. Marcus's disappointment hurt more than any client's scolding. It was the pain of letting down someone who genuinely cared. In his Brooklyn apartment, the physical chaos of his space began to mirror the chaos in his mind. Empty pizza boxes accumulated, clothes formed disorganized piles, and the natural light, once a source of inspiration, now seemed only to illuminate the mess of his inaction. Social media, once a distraction, became a minefield. Seeing the success of other artists, some less talented than himself, who launched projects and landed big contracts, was a silent torture. His early morning anxiety intensified, and he found himself awake, staring at the ceiling with the weight of his missed deadlines and broken promises. The climax of this escalation came with a financial ultimatum. The rent for his spacious Brooklyn apartment, though affordable because he had secured it years ago, was becoming unsustainable with the continuous loss of large contracts. A friendly but firm eviction notice from his landlord made him stop short. If Ethan couldn't secure a major project and receive a substantial upfront payment within 2 weeks, he would have to move out. The comfort and creative space he had neglected were in imminent danger. Ethan felt the ground give way beneath him. Procrastination was no longer just an internal flaw, it was a palpable threat that now put his very existence in New York at risk. He had to act, and fast. But the paralysis still held him. Asterisk. The eviction notice wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a cold slap of reality for Ethan. The last 2 weeks had been a blur of anxiety. He had tried to force himself to work, but the paralysis was stronger. He looked at the project he needed to pay the rent-a rebranding campaign for a successful hipster coffee shop in Williamsburg, and the ideas wouldn't come. They came but seemed imperfect. The first sting of a painful turning point came when he opened his laptop, and by chance, a New York Times article popped up on his screen. The headline, "Why You Can't Start," unmasking procrastination as fear of imperfection, seemed to have been written just for him. The article talked about analysis paralysis, the pursuit of perfection leading to inaction, and self-sabotage as a defense mechanism against perceived failure. Every sentence was a mirror. He read about how procrastination isn't laziness, but a symptom of deeper fears, like the fear of not being good enough, the fear of judgment, the fear that the final product won't live up to the grandeur of the original idea. Ethan felt a chill. It was the first time he had seen his experience so clearly articulated, and the truth was brutal. He wasn't being lazy. He was afraid. The second piece of the turning point puzzle came from an unexpected source, an old Marcus's Instagram post. In a moment of distraction, Ethan was scrolling through his feed and saw a photo of Marcus in his studio. It's not with a finished masterpiece, but with a scribbled sketch and a simple caption, "Failed today, but I showed up. That's the real win." It hit Ethan like lightning. Marcus, his mentor, the artist he admired so much, spoke openly about failing and the importance of showing up. Marcus never sought perfection in the first stroke. He celebrated the process. This simple sentence disarmed Ethan's core belief that every step had to be impeccable. Success wasn't about perfection. It was about presence and resilience. But the final blow, which shattered Ethan's shell of denial, came in the form of a fortuitous reunion with an old college colleague, Liam. Ethan was at a coffee shop pretending to work on the Williamsburg coffee shop project when Liam spotted him. Liam, whom Ethan had always considered less talented, was radiant. "Ethan, man, great to see you. I just closed a seed funding round for my startup. Remember that crazy idea about using AI to create art I told you about in college? Well, it finally took off. By the way, I sent you an email a few months ago about a collaboration, but I didn't hear back. Too bad, we would have killed it." Liam, who had been praised by Ethan for his courage to start rather than his technical perfection in college, was living the dream Ethan was only procrastinating on. That encounter was a punch to the gut. Liam wasn't technically the best, but he acted. The gap between Ethan's potential and his reality became painfully clear. Ethan returned home, The eviction notice still on his mind. The New York Times article. On his screen, Marcus's quote about showing up and Liam's success, what embraced imperfection to take action, converged into an overwhelming revelation. He wasn't lazy. He was afraid to fail. And that fear was costing him everything: his career, his credibility, his friendships, and now, his home. Sitting amidst the chaos of his apartment, Ethan, for the first time in a long time, didn't seek a distraction. He stared at the blank screen of his computer, and instead of feeling paralysis, he felt a mix of despair and a sharp pang of anger, and a banger anger at himself for so much lost time. He no longer wanted to be the almost artist, the master of unrealized ideas. He had to change. The only way out was to take the first step, even if it was imperfect. Asterisk. The impact of the landlord's ultimatum and the epiphany about the root of his procrastination, fear of not being good enough, plunged Ethan into a mix of despair and a sharp pang of anger at himself. The shell of denial had cracked. No longer about laziness, but about the raw truth of his insecurity. The first immediate consequence was an even greater isolation. But this time it was different. Before, he isolated himself to procrastinate. Now, it was an isolation of painful self-reflection. Turned off his phone, avoided Marcus's calls, and for an entire day, just stared at the wall of his messy apartment. Tolerable now felt suffocating, a physical reflection of the chaos in his mind. He felt the weight of all the lost opportunities, of the promises broken to himself and others. This forced solitude, however, pushed him into an unprecedented internal confrontation. The second consequence was an initial, clumsy attempt to organize his life. Inspired by a subby time in the New York Times article about taking the first step, Ethan grabbed trash bags and started cleaning his apartment. It wasn't a perfect clean, far from it, but it was an action. He threw out empty pizza boxes, organized piles of clothes, and cleared his workstation that was covered in papers and junk. This small victory over physical chaos, however insignificant, it seemed generated a tiny wave of positive energy. He realized that action, however small, could break inertia. Marcus's reaction, his mentor, was a mix of skepticism and cautious hope. When Ethan finally answered one of his calls, Marcus didn't scold him. "Ethan, I know how much you care about your work, but I also know you're getting lost in your own head. You need help." He suggested Ethan seek a therapist specializing in anxiety and perfectionism, and also challenged him to sign up for a quick drawing for artist workshop at a local gallery, focused on unleashing creativity without the pursuit of perfection. Ethan was reluctant, but the fear of losing his apartment spurred him on. He booked the first session with Dr. Vivian Lee, a psychologist recommended by Marcus. The first sessions with Dr. Lee were uncomfortable. Ethan, accustomed to hiding behind his busy artist facade, had to unpack his deepest fears. He talked about the pressure of being the talented one in school, the fear of being judged, the belief that his worth was intrinsically linked to the perfection of his work. Dr. Lee didn't cure him immediately, but provided tools to recognize his triggers and encouraged him to focus on the process, not just the final product. Meanwhile, the reality of the Williamsburg coffee shop project loomed. The deadline was fast approaching, and the pressure was immense. Ethan tried to approach the project with the new just start mindset, but every stroke felt wrong, felt the frustration and the temptation to give up again. The coffee shop team's initial reaction to his delay was impatience and veiled threats of termination. Ethan had to humble himself, openly admitting his delays and pleading for one last chance, promising a partial delivery within 24 hours. This was the first time he had exposed himself so vulnerably to a client. The experience was terrifying, but also, somehow, liberating. The consequences of Ethan's procrastination were becoming palpable and painful. He was de-isolating himself, confronting his insecurities, and taking small but significant steps out of his comfort zone. The journey would be arduous, but the fear of losing his home and the shame of disappointing Marcus had lit a spark. He was finally ready for the fight. Ethan's first actions were a mix of panic and a newly discovered thread of hope. With the eviction notice hanging like a sword over his head and the Williamsburg coffee shop project at risk, he had no choice but to act. His first session with Dr. Vivian Lee had been a milestone, not for a magical solution, but for the validation of his fears and the promise of tools. The real escalating conflict began when Ethan tried to apply Dr. Lee's advice. Ethan, start small. Imperfection is the first draft of perfection. He opened the coffee shop project file, his heart pounding. Instead of trying to create the perfect final logo, he forced himself to draw 10 quick raw versions in just 10 minutes. It was awful. Scribbles, incomplete ideas, but he did it. The feeling of having finished something, even if it was a bad draft, was strangely liberating. This small victory prompted him to make the promised partial delivery to the coffee shop team, a concept sketch he would have hidden before. Their initial reaction was mixed. There was still irritation about the delay, but they saw he was moving. The quick drawing for artist workshop suggested by Marcus was another battleground. Ethan, accustomed to working in isolation, felt terribly exposed. The facilitator encouraged participants to do 30-second drawings without thinking, just feeling and sketching. It was Ethan's personal hell. His first drawings were stiff, self-conscious, but watching others, some less talented than him, drawing with joy and carefree abandon, he began to relax. With each session, the pressure of perfection lessened. A bit, he began to see that the process was more important than the final product, and that freedom came from allowing himself to make mistakes. With each imperfect stroke, a small piece of his armor chipped away. The reconciliation with Marcus was also a process of escalating conflict. Ethan had to call him and openly admit his fear and procrastination. Marcus, instead of judging him, shared his own past struggles with perfection. I know, Ethan. I've been there. Trick is to show up, even when you don't want to. The only way through it. This conversation didn't solve everything, but it rebuilt trust. Marcus began to check in on Ethan more closely. Not as a boss, but as a peer who understood his struggle. Offering small challenges and check-ins that kept Ethan accountable. However, it wasn't all easy. The financial pressure continued. Was overdue, and he still needed a big contract. The temptation to revert to old procrastination habits was enormous. He found himself spending hours browse online, making excuses, feeling the familiar wave of anxiety. But now he had Dr. Lee's tools to identify these triggers. He practiced the 5-minute rule. If he procrastinated, he forced himself to work on the project for at least 5 minutes. Often, those 5 minutes stretched longer. The coffee shop project, even with partial deliveries, was still a challenge. The client team was frustrated. Ethan had to respond to angry emails and deal with the feeling of letting them down. The conflict was external with the client and internal with his own urge to give up. He began to realize that conflict was not something to be avoided, but an inevitable part of the growth process. Ethan was far from cured. With every step forward, there was the temptation of 2 steps back. But for the first time, he was actively engaged in the fight. The pain of the consequences and the unexpected support from Marcus and Dr. Lee fueled him. He was learning to show up, to act, to fail, and, most importantly, to keep going. The king of inertia was beginning to move. Dr. Vivian Lee's tools and Marcus's cautious support began to bear fruit, but Ethan's path was far from easy. Every small victory was followed by a new barrier, constant reminder of old habits. The first major barrier to overcome was the anxiety of starting the Williamsburg coffee shop project. Even with the new techniques, the blank screen still seemed like a monster. Dr. Lee had suggested the elephant slicing technique, breaking the project into microtasks, so small they seemed insignificant. Instead of create the final logo, he listed open software, create new file, draw circle, add temporary text. With each microtask completed, he felt a small relief and a boost. Slowly, painfully, the coffee shop project began to take shape. The first deliveries, though still imperfect, were made within the new, partial deadlines he negotiated. With cold sweat, rebuilding his reputation with the coffee shop team was another obstacle. They were frustrated, and Ethan felt the pressure, started sending daily updates, even small ones, and being proactive in his communications. Instead of waiting for questions to come, he anticipated them. I'm working on the color palette. Today, I'll send a draft by the end of the afternoon. This transparency and accountability were new for them and for Ethan, although there was still distrust. The coffee shop team began to see a different Ethan, one who was, in fact, delivering. The quick drawing workshop became his weekly sanctuary. In the first few sessions, he felt like a failure, his drawings clumsy compared to others. But the facilitator and his incredibly supportive peers celebrated effort, not perfection. Great energy on that line. Love the boldness. They would say even about scribbles, Ethan began to internalize. It's not about being perfect. It's about being free. He started laughing at his own mistakes, seeing beauty in imperfection, and enjoying the act of creating without the weight of judgment. It was a visceral liberation that began to translate into his digital work. The hardest barrier, however, was rebuilding his relationship with Marcus. Marcus was patient, but firm. He challenged Ethan to send him incomplete work, just for progress feedback, not for final evaluation. This vulnerability was terrifying for Ethan, but when Marcus saw the drafts, he pointed out the potential, the strengths, and offered constructive suggestions without the destructive criticism Ethan so feared. There it is, Ethan. The idea I knew you had. Now, finish it. Marcus didn't rescue him, but guided him and reminded him of his talent. This mutual trust began to bloom again, strengthening Ethan's support network. Amidst these challenges, Ethan felt the first signs of relief. His early morning anxiety began to subside. He still had sleepless nights, but they were no longer dominated by guilt and paralysis. There was a new energy, fueled by the satisfaction of small victories and the hope that he could truly change. His life, the barrier of procrastination, was still there, but now Ethan had tools, support, and, for the first time in a long time, the courage to face it head-on. He was learning to act through fear, not wait for fear to disappear to act. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of hard work and small, yet significant victories for Ethan. Dr. Lee's discipline of slicing the elephant and the 5-minute rule, combined with Marcus's just show up philosophy, began to yield tangible results. The Williamsburg coffee shop project, which once seemed like a monster, finally began to take shape. Ethan, embracing the imperfect draft mindset, managed to deliver the requested revisions and, to his surprise, the final logo and rebranding. Campaign design was not only functional, but innovative and soulful. The coffee shop team, initially skeptical, was genuinely impressed. On the day of the final presentation, the owner, a former Wall Street marketing executive, looked at Ethan with newfound respect. "Ethan," he said, "you delivered. And what you delivered is excellent. There was a delay, yes, but the end result exceeded my expectations. You have a bright future." The coffee shop not only accepted the work, but hired him for future projects and gave him a generous bonus, which was crucial for resolving the rent ultimatum. This was Ethan's first major material victory over procrastination, proof that imperfect action leads to real results. His reconciliation with Marcus deepened, transforming into a more solid and meaningful partnership. Marcus not only continued to be his mentor, but became a true friend and confidant. Seeing Ethan's determination and progress, Marcus invited him to collaborate on a major project for a renowned art gallery in Chelsea. It wasn't a project Marcus was giving him, but one where they would work together as equals, with Marcus delegating important parts and fully trusting Ethan. This opportunity was the professional validation Ethan so desperately sought. Not for external recognition itself, but for proof that he had regained the trust of someone he deeply admired. With every brainstorming session with Marcus, Ethan's creativity flowed freely, unhindered by self-censorship. With Dr. Lee, the sessions shifted from venting to building. They worked on strategies to manage performance anxiety, develop resilience to criticism, and cultivate self-compassion. Ethan began to practice mindfulness, noticing when perfection, Anxiety arose and learning not to be swept away by it. He also started keeping a journal of small victories, noting every time he just started or delivered something imperfect. Gratitude for these small daily achievements began to replace the weight of guilt. Ethan's biggest achievement was the launch of his online portfolio. It was a project he had been putting off for years, filled with conceptual artworks he considered never ready. With his new mindset, he selected his best works, including some he still viewed as imperfect, and with Marcus's help for a quick final review, he finally hit the publish button. The response was overwhelming. Peers, former professors, and even some artists he admired began reaching out, praising his originality and boldness. New collaboration opportunities and even invitations to speak at smaller universities began to emerge. Ethan didn't become immune to procrastination or the fear of failure. There were days when he still felt the old paralysis trying to creep back, but now he had the tools and the awareness. He was no longer the paralyzed king on his throne of procrastination. He was an artist in motion, accepting imperfection as an integral part of his creative journey, and finally embracing the flow of action. Despite the small victories and progress, Ethan had not yet faced his ultimate test. The definitive proof of his transformation. He had managed to keep his apartment in Brooklyn, and the coffee shop project was complete, but the fear of imperfection still lingered, especially when it came to bigger risks. The ultimate test came in the form of an unexpected invitation from Marcus. "Ethan," Marcus said over the phone, "remember Liam, your college buddy? His startup, Ether AI, is blowing up. They saw your new online portfolio, the one you finally published. Congrats on that, by the way, and they were really impressed with a specific generative art concept you explored. They're looking for a lead artist to head up the visual development of an innovative new feature that will be presented at New York Tech Week in just 1 month. It's a huge showcase. I recommended you to them, and they want a detailed design proposal and some mock-ups in 2 weeks." Ethan's heart pounded. It was the kind of opportunity he had always dreamed of, but also the kind of project his old procrastination would have destroyed. Liam, whom he had underestimated, was now offering him the chance of a lifetime. But the pressure was immense. New York Tech Week, a world-renowned event, a tight deadline, 2 weeks for the proposal, and the need to deliver something truly innovative under the industry spotlight. The old fear of failure and imperfection roared in his mind. In the first few days, the temptation to procrastinate was almost overwhelming. He found himself aimlessly browse the internet, obsessively reviewing Liam's emails, feeling the familiar weight of inertia. Voices in his head screamed, "You're not good enough for this. You're going to mess everything up. It's better not to start than to deliver something mediocre on such a big stage." His early morning anxiety returned in full force. The apartment he had cleaned seemed suffocating again. He booked an emergency session with Dr. Lee. She listened patiently. "Ethan," she said, "this isn't about the perfection of the work. It's about your ability to tolerate uncertainty and act despite fear. You have the tools. Remember the 5-minute rule? The slicing the elephant technique? Just showing up?" She reminded him that he had already overcome barriers in smaller projects. The difference now is the size of the stage, but the process is the same. She challenged him to focus on delivering an honest and functional draft, not an initial masterpiece. The real conflict happened when Ethan sat down to start the project. He had agreed to a video call with Liam and Marcus, and the silence on the line as he waited for the connection was deafening. Liam and Ether, a CEO, a young visionary named Alex, were on the call. They expected brilliant ideas. Ethan, feeling like an imposter, stared at the blank screen. The pressure was almost physical. He had to present an idea, an initial concept, even if it wasn't perfect. The temptation to put it off, to say he needed more time, was immense. He took a deep breath, remembered Marcus's advice to just show up, and with trembling hands, began to sketch a rough concept on the screen. Explaining his reasoning in real time, admitting the gaps, and asking for feedback. It wasn't his best performance, but it was authentic and proactive. Liam and Alex's reaction was surprising. They saw the honesty and the potential, and they were willing to collaborate. The ultimate test wasn't just about delivering the project, but about facing the fear of failure on its largest scale. Ethan was in the spotlight, with the risk of a spectacular fall. His ability to apply the tools under pressure and to be vulnerable, even when everything cried out for perfection, would be the final test of his transformation. The battle against procrastination had escalated into a full-scale war, and Ethan was on the battlefield ready to fight. The days leading up to New York Tech Week were a marathon of hard work and self-confrontation for Ethan. The Ether AI project, innovative, interactive visualization for the company's generative art feature, demanded his best. He applied all the tools Dr. Lee and Marcus had taught him, slicing the elephant into the smallest tasks. The 5-minute rule to get started, and, crucially, the mindset of just start and accept the rough draft. He worked in increments, sending daily updates to Liam and Alex, asking for feedback, and quickly incorporating it rather than seeking isolated perfectionism. The tension was almost unbearable. Ethan felt the weight of all the lost opportunities, all the what-ifs that had haunted him for years. This was the moment to prove to himself that he had truly changed. His apartment, though still chaotic, now had a different energy. A battlefield where he was actively fighting. The climax came on the morning of the presentation at New York Tech Week. Ethan was backstage with Liam and Alex. The venue was packed with investors, journalists, and tech titans. The blinding lights and the buzz of the audience were overwhelming. The giant screen behind them displayed the Ether AI logo. The script was tight, an introduction by Alex, a demonstration by Liam, and then Ethan's big visual reveal. Minutes. Before going on stage, Ethan felt the old paralysis creep back. The voices of fear returned in full force. What if the design isn't impactful enough? What if the feature crashes? What if they laugh at you? His hands trembled, and a wave of nausea rose. Looked at Liam, who noticed his nervousness. Liam, with an understanding smile, simply said, "You've got this, Ethan. Just show up." Then Marcus appeared backstage, his gaze calm and encouraging. He said nothing, just gave a slight nod as if to say, "I trust you." In that moment, Ethan didn't feel the pressure of perfection, but the strength of his support network and the need to honor himself and them. Ethan's turn arrived. Alex gave his introduction, and Liam handed the microphone to him. Ethan stepped onto the stage. The spotlight blinded him for an instant. He saw a crowd of faces waiting, for the first time. He didn't try to be perfect. He just took a deep breath and began, with a voice initially a little choked, but which soon gained firmness. Ethan explained the concept behind the visual design. He demonstrated the interface of the new feature, showing the generative art transitions. There were no technical failures, but there was a crucial moment where he could have hesitated. A small visual bug appeared in one of the mock-ups. He was presenting a pixel out of place, a slight distortion that only a trained eye would notice. The old Ethan would have frozen, apologized, or frantically tried to fix it. But the new Ethan, the one who accepted imperfection, just smiled. Like every great work of art, he improvised with slight humor. Our system is still learning and evolving, and even in imperfection, a unique beauty resides. The audience, to his surprise, laughed and applauded. Liam and Alex smiled, relieved. Ethan's moment of vulnerability and authenticity, instead of being a disaster, became a highlight of the presentation. He hadn't delivered a perfect product, but he had delivered a functional product with an authentic performance, showing his ability to adapt and to be real. The project was a resounding success at Tech Week. Investors flocked. The press praised the innovation and design, but for Ethan, the true victory was not the external acclaim. It was the feeling of having overcome himself, of having faced fear head-on, and of having acted despite paralysis. He was no longer a prisoner of perfection. He was a free artist who had found his voice and his courage on the most challenging stage of his life. After the presentation at New York Tech Week, Ethan's life didn't magically transform into an anxiety-free utopia. However, the earthquake he had provoked in his own inner and outer world, by confronting his fears and taking action, established a new foundation for his existence. Ether AI offered Ethan a contract as creative director of generative art, prestigious position he accepted with a newfound sense of humility and genuine enthusiasm. The experience of collaborating closely with Liam and Alex, and being part of a team that valued innovation and the process more than immediate perfection, was exactly the environment he needed to flourish. The work itself was challenging, but now he had the tools to manage the pressure. He broke projects down into tiny steps, celebrated partial deliveries, and constantly asked for feedback. Procrastination didn't disappear completely. It was still an old shadow that occasionally tried to creep back, but now Ethan recognized it, understood its root fear, and knew how to push it back. His relationship with Marcus blossomed even further. They continued to collaborate on personal projects, and Marcus became an essential confidant, someone with whom Ethan could be completely vulnerable about his ongoing struggles. Ethan's story became, in a way, an inspiration for Marcus too, reminding him of the importance of staying adaptable and supporting new talent. Sessions with Dr. Vivian Lee transitioned from weekly to bi-weekly and eventually monthly. Therapy became a maintenance space, where Ethan refined his self-awareness and resilience skills. He had learned that perfection was not the ultimate goal, but rather consistent progress and the ability to tolerate imperfection. He began to embrace the philosophy that done is better than perfect when paralysis threatened. And that quality was a process of iteration, not an initial state. On a personal level, Ethan's Brooklyn apartment, though still reflecting an artist's creative energy, was noticeably more organized. He no longer lived under the threat of eviction and had stabilized his finances. More importantly, he had rediscovered the joy of creating for himself, not just for client projects. He started painting digitally as a hobby, without the pressure to sell or exhibit. It's purely for pleasure. Ethan's final reflection was simple, yet profound. Procrastination was not a sign of laziness or lack of discipline, but a symptom of a deeper fear, the fear of failure and imperfection. By facing this fear, by learning to act despite it, and by embracing the process instead of the final outcome, he had unlocked his true potential. He was no longer a prisoner of his mind, but a free creator who, imperfect like every human being, was constantly moving, learning, growing, and, most importantly, starting. Ethan Miller's journey against procrastination and the fear of imperfection was a living testament to several crucial lessons, applicable to anyone who finds themselves paralyzed by the what if it's not perfect. Procrastination isn't laziness. It's fear. The main lesson Ethan learned was that his inertia wasn't a character flaw, but a symptom of deeper fears. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of not meeting his own high expectations. Recognizing the root of the problem is the first step to overcoming it. Done is better than perfect at first. The incessant pursuit of perfection before even starting is a saboteur. Ethan discovered the freedom in taking the first step, however imperfect. The rough draft, the sketch, the raw idea are essential. For the work to evolve, small action breaks paralysis. Techniques like slicing the elephant, breaking large tasks into tiny ones, and the 5-minute rule proved powerful. Starting a task for a minimum amount of time, even without wanting to, often generates the momentum needed to continue. Vulnerability and seeking help, Ethan only began to change when he allowed himself to be vulnerable, admitting his fears and seeking support. Therapy with Dr. Lee and mentorship from Marcus were fundamental in providing tools, strategies, and accountability. The process is worth more than the final product. The quick drawing workshop taught Ethan to celebrate the act of creating and to find joy in the process, not just the final outcome. This shift in focus freed his creativity and reduced pressure, resilience to criticism and failure. Ethan's ability to present imperfect work at New York Tech Week and handle the small bug with humor demonstrated his new resilience. Mistakes and imperfections are part of learning and growth, not an end in themselves. Building a support network, the support from Marcus,
Dr. Lee,
and even the reunion with Liam were essential. Having people who believe in you, who offer constructive feedback, and who hold you accountable is crucial for change. Consistent progress, it's not constant perfection. Ethan understood that the fight against procrastination is ongoing. There will be bad days. The goal is not to never procrastinate again, but to have the tools to recognize and regain control. It's making consistent progress over time. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder that the biggest obstacle to our potential is usually not a lack of talent, but the fear that prevents us from starting. Ethan Miller's story is a mirror. If you saw yourself in his struggle to start, in the anxiety of perfectionism, or in the weight of procrastination preventing you from reaching your dreams, know that you are not alone. Ethan's journey shows that talent isn't enough. It takes courage to take the first step and discipline to continue. Even when everything feels imperfect, your story can also be one of overcoming. Reflect. What fear of imperfection is holding you back from starting? What project of yours remains in the drawer? Start small. Like Ethan, take a tiny step today. Just 5 minutes. Just the first stroke. Just one email. Seek support. Don't hesitate to reach out to a mentor, a trusted friend, or a professional. Sharing your struggle is the first step to disarming it. Celebrate the process. Embrace progress, not perfection. Every step, no matter how small, is a victory. If Ethan's story inspired you, we'd love to hear yours. So leave a like if you resonated with Ethan's journey. Comment below. What's your biggest struggle with procrastination? What small step will you take today? Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories of transformation and overcoming. Share this video with someone who needs a little push to get started. Embrace imperfection. Take the first step and watch your potential unfold.